The autumn fog rolled through the narrow streets of Bethnal Green in East London, carrying with it the acrid smell of smoke and brick dust. It was October 1940, and the city had been enduring the relentless German bombing campaign for weeks. Thomas Ashford stood behind the mahogany bar of the King's Arms, a modest pub that had served the neighborhood since before the Great War. His hands moved with practiced precision as he arranged glasses on the counter, but tonight, like every night since the raids began, his arrangement held a meaning that only a select few understood. The pub's windows had been blown out twice already and replaced with wooden boards and whatever glass could be salvaged. Blackout curtains hung heavy at every opening, ensuring not even a sliver of light would guide enemy bombers overhead. Inside, the warm glow of oil lamps cast dancing shadows across the worried faces of regulars who sought refuge in familiar surroundings and weak beer rationed by the war effort. Before we continue with Thomas's story, if you're enjoying this glimpse into wartime London, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more historical stories to life. Thomas was 42 years old, with graying hair at his temples and lines etched deep around his eyes from years of early mornings and late nights. He had owned the King's Arms for 15 years, having taken it over from his father, who had run it before him. The pub was more than a business to Thomas. It was the heartbeat of the community, a place where dock workers, factory laborers, shop owners, and their families gathered to share the burdens of war. His wife Margaret worked alongside him most evenings, her presence a calming force when air raid sirens wailed and panic threatened to overwhelm their patrons. She was a petite woman with auburn hair pinned in the practical style of the times, and she had a remarkable ability to remember every regular's name, their troubles, and their preferred drink. Together, they had created a sanctuary in the midst of chaos. The system had started almost by accident 3 weeks earlier. Thomas had noticed that the Luftwaffe raids followed patterns. Certain nights, when atmospheric conditions were right and the moon provided enough light for navigation, the German bombers would arrive in greater numbers. He had spent years observing the skies as a hobby astronomer before the war, and now that knowledge took on a grimmer purpose. Harold Sutton, an air raid warden who stopped by the pub each evening before his shift, had been the first to notice Thomas's glass arrangements. Harold was a tall, thin man in his 50s, who had worked as an accountant before the war, transformed him into someone responsible for keeping his neighbors alive during the nightly terror from above. He had sharp eyes behind his round spectacles, and he noticed everything. One evening, Harold had leaned across the bar and spoken quietly. "Those glasses, Thomas. You've got them in a row when you think it'll be a light night, scattered when you expect it heavy. Am I reading that right?" Thomas had frozen for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Noticed that, did you? The moon phase, the wind direction, the cloud cover? I've been keeping track. Some nights you can just feel it in the air." Harold had glanced around to ensure no one was listening too closely. "That's useful information, Tom. Very useful. There are people who'd benefit from knowing when to expect the worst of it." From that conversation, a quiet network had formed. Nothing official, nothing that would attract the attention of authorities who might consider it defeatist or spreading alarm. Just a simple code understood by a handful of people who trusted each other with their lives. When Thomas arranged the glasses in neat rows along the bar, it meant he expected a relatively quiet night. When they were scattered in deliberate disorder, spelling out the letters M-A-D in a way that looked random to the untrained eye, it meant the conditions were right for a major raid. The information spread through whispers and knowing glances. Harold would see the arrangement and pass the word to other wardens. They would ensure that the most vulnerable shelters were properly staffed, that medical supplies were positioned strategically, that volunteers were ready. It wasn't about panic. It was about preparation. Tonight, the glasses spelled mad. Thomas had studied the conditions all afternoon. The clouds had broken up just enough. The moon would be bright in a few hours, and the wind was shifting to carry the sound of aircraft engines away from the listening posts on the coast until it was too late for much warning. His stomach churned with the knowledge of what was coming. Margaret appeared at his elbow, her hand briefly touching his back. "You're certain?" she asked quietly. "As certain as I can be," he replied, not looking at her, continuing to wipe down the bar. "Harold will be in soon." The pub door opened, bringing a gust of cold October air and 3 young women from the munitions factory down the road. Their faces were yellow-tinged from handling TNT, a mark of their contribution to the war effort that they bore with grim pride. They were laughing about something, trying to hold onto normalcy for a few precious hours before the sirens would inevitably wail. "Evening, Mr. Ashford, Mrs. Ashford," the tallest one called out. Her name was Dorothy, and she couldn't have been more than 20. 3 halves of bitter, if you've got it. "For you ladies, always," Thomas replied with a warm smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He poured their drinks, his mind calculating how many hours of peace they had left. The evening wore on, and the pub filled with its usual crowd. Old Jack Thornton sat in his customary corner, his one remaining arm resting on the table. He'd lost the other in the Great War, and now listened to the younger men discuss this new war with a cynical wisdom born of experience. The Morrison family came in together, parents and 3 teenage children, preferring to spend what might be their last hours together in familiar company rather than isolated in their damaged flat. Harold Sutton arrived at 7:30, his warden's helmet under his arm and his gas mask bag slung across his chest. He approached the bar, and his eyes immediately found the scattered glasses. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Pint of mild, Thomas," he said casually, but his hand trembled slightly as he reached for his wallet. "On the house tonight, Harold," Thomas replied, pouring the drink. As he set it down, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Before midnight, I'd wager, and it'll be sustained. The moon will be too bright." Harold nodded, took a long drink, then set the glass down. "I'll make sure everyone's ready. The Anderson shelters on Dunbridge Street are holding water. We'll need to redirect people to the church crypt." "The Morrison family's here," Thomas said with a subtle glance toward the family's table. "Their flat took damage last week. The ceiling's unstable." "I'll have a word," Harold replied. He finished his drink and moved through the pub with practiced ease, stopping at various tables for seemingly casual conversations that were anything but. Thomas watched him work, spreading preparation without spreading panic. Margaret served drinks and exchanged pleasantries while her eyes constantly tracked Thomas, reading his mood, offering silent support. She knew what the scattered glasses meant. They all did now, all the regulars who had learned to watch for the signal. At 9:00, Thomas made a decision. He pulled Margaret aside, near the back room where they kept the minimal supplies they were allotted. "We should send people to the shelters early tonight," he said, "before the sirens. Tell them we're closing up, that I'm not feeling well. Something believable." Margaret studied his face, seeing the weight of responsibility there. "You're sure it's going to be bad?" "The worst we've seen yet," he replied. "Everything's aligned for it, Maggie. I can feel it in my bones." She squeezed his hand, then nodded. "I'll start clearing people out gently." But fate had other plans. At 9:20, before they could implement their quiet evacuation, the first siren began its mournful wail. The sound cut through the low murmur of conversation like a knife, and every face in the pub turned pale. "Right then," Thomas called out with forced calm. "Everyone knows the drill. The nearest shelter's the church crypt on Wilmot Street. Morrison family, you're with Harold. Everyone else, move quickly but don't run. Watch for Warden's directions." The pub emptied in controlled chaos. Years of drills and too many real raids had taught these people how to move efficiently. Dorothy and her factory friends linked arms and headed out together, their earlier laughter forgotten. Old Jack Thornton struggled with his coat until Margaret helped him, then watched him shuffle out with a speed that belied his years. Thomas and Margaret worked quickly to secure what they could, banking the fire, locking the till, ensuring that anything flammable was moved away from windows. They had learned these lessons through bitter experience. "Tom," Margaret said as they prepared to leave, "what you do with the glasses. It's saved lives, you know that?" "I hope so," he replied, pulling on his coat. "I hope to God it's made some difference." They locked the door and headed toward the church crypt that served as one of the neighborhood's primary shelters. Already they could hear the distant thrum of aircraft engines, that low, menacing growl that made stomachs clench and hearts race. The searchlights had begun their sweeping dance across the sky, probing for the enemy that was still minutes away. The church crypt was packed with bodies by the time they arrived. Families huddled together on benches and on the floor. Children whimpered and were hushed by mothers who tried to mask their own fear. Thomas and Margaret found a spot against the damp stone wall, and Thomas immediately began helping to organize the space, ensuring that the elderly and the children with young mothers had the most protected positions away from the entrance. Harold Sutton appeared, moving through the shelter with quiet authority. "Medical supplies are in the vestry. We've got a doctor on call 2 streets over. Water containers are full. Should be able to hold out till the all clear." Thomas caught his eye. "How many didn't make it to shelter?" "Fire watch crews are still on the roofs," Harold replied grimly. "Can't be helped. They need to spot the incendiaries. And there's always some fool who refuses to leave their home." The first explosion came at 9:45, distant but powerful enough to send vibrations through the ground. It was followed by another, then another, and soon the world above them had transformed into hell. The bombardment was relentless, wave after wave of German bombers dropping their payloads across the East End. In the crypt, people tried to distract themselves in whatever ways they could. Someone started singing, "It's a Long Way to Tipperary," and others joined in, their voices shaking but defiant. Margaret held the hand of a young mother whose infant wouldn't stop crying, offering comfort, while Thomas helped Harold coordinate the volunteers who would venture out during lulls to fight fires and pull people from rubble. The night stretched on endlessly, Each explosion seemed closer than the last. Dust rained down from the crypt ceiling with every impact. A water pipe burst somewhere overhead, and soon water was trickling down the stone walls, adding to the misery. But they endured because there was no other choice. Thomas found himself thinking about his father, about all the years of running the pub before this war had turned everything upside down. His father had served in the Great War, had seen horror that he rarely spoke about. Thomas had been too young for that war, but now he found himself in his own kind of combat, one where the weapons fell from the sky and the battlefield was his own neighborhood. Around 2 a.m, there was a lull. Harold and several other wardens ventured out to assess the damage. When they returned, their faces were grim and streaked with soot. "Dunbridge Street is gone," Harold reported quietly to Thomas, pulling him aside. "Direct hit on the row of houses. We've got casualties. The fire crews are overwhelmed." Thomas felt his throat tighten. He knew people on Dunbridge Street, the Wilsons, the elderly couple at number 14, the family with 4 children at number 22, all likely gone in an instant. "The King's Arms?" he asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. "Still standing last I saw," Harold replied, "but the building next to it took damage. Might spread if the fires aren't contained." The raid continued until just before dawn, the final waves of bombers dropping their remaining loads as they turned back toward the channel. When the all-clear finally sounded at 5:30, the people in the shelter emerged into a changed world. The sunrise revealed a landscape of destruction. Entire blocks were reduced to smoking rubble. Fires still burned out of control in several directions. The smell of burning wood, rubber, and worse hung thick in the air. And yet, through it all, people immediately began the work of survival. Fire crews battled the blazes. Rescue workers dug through rubble, searching for survivors. Neighbors helped neighbors, sharing what little they had. Thomas and Margaret picked their way through debris-strewn streets back to the King's Arms. The building next door had indeed taken a hit, and the side wall of the pub showed significant damage, but the structure still stood. Glass crunched under their feet as they entered through the broken door. The interior was chaos. The blast had thrown bottles from shelves, overturned tables, and cracked the beautiful mirror that had hung behind the bar for 50 years. But it could be repaired. It would be repaired. "We were lucky," Margaret said softly, surveying the damage. "Others weren't," Thomas replied, thinking of Dunbridge Street, of all the faces that wouldn't return to the pub. "But we'll rebuild. We always do." Over the following days, the neighborhood began its recovery. The confirmed death toll from that night's raid was staggering. 23 people killed within a half-mile radius of the King's Arms. Countless more injured. Dozens of homes completely destroyed. But Thomas also heard the other numbers, the ones not published in newspapers. The numbers Harold shared quietly over a drink when the pub reopened 3 days later with boarded windows and mismatched furniture salvaged from destroyed homes. "The evacuation protocols you helped us establish," Harold said, staring into his pint. "The preparations we made because of your warning. We estimate it saved at least 15 lives that night, Tom. Maybe more. People were in the right shelters, the ones that held. Medical supplies were positioned where they were needed most. It made a difference." Thomas didn't feel heroic. He felt exhausted and haunted by the faces of those who hadn't survived. But he nodded slowly. "I'll keep watching the conditions, keep working out the patterns, as long as it helps." "It does," Harold assured him. "More than you know." The war continued, of course. The raids went on through that winter and into the spring. Thomas maintained his system, the scattered glasses spelling mad when conditions indicated a major raid, neat rows when the night might pass more quietly. The network of people who understood the code grew slightly, always carefully, always built on trust. There were nights when he was wrong, when the expected heavy raid never materialized, and he would second-guess himself for days afterward. But there were more nights when he was right, when his observations gave people precious hours to prepare, to take shelter in the safest locations, to position resources where they would be most needed. In January 1941, a particularly heavy raid saw incendiary bombs rain down across the East End. The King's Arms was hit by one, and it was only the quick action of a fire watch crew that saved the building from burning to the ground. Thomas and Margaret arrived to find the pub damaged but salvageable, and neighbors already organizing a working party to help with repairs. "You've done right by this neighborhood, Tom," old Jack Thornton said, his one arm clapping Thomas on the shoulder. "Pub's the heart of a community. You keep that heart beating, and we'll all keep fighting." The rebuilding became a community effort. Carpenters shared materials. Electricians donated their time. The pub became more than just Thomas's business. It became a symbol of resilience, of neighbors supporting neighbors through the darkest of times. Among those who helped rebuild was a young man named Peter Walsh, barely 18 years old, who had been training as a carpenter's apprentice before the war interrupted everything. His father had been killed at Dunkirk, and his mother worked double shifts at a textile factory converting to parachute production. Peter spent his evenings helping repair damaged buildings, finding purpose in reconstruction after so much destruction. "Mr. Ashford," Peter said one evening as they worked together, replacing charred floorboards, "my mom told me about the glasses, about how you warned people when the big raids were coming." He paused, running his hand over a piece of wood, checking for splinters. "She said it's why she made it to the tube station in time on November 15th. The night her factory took a direct hit during the shift change." Thomas stopped working and looked at the young man. "Your mother works at Kellerman's Textiles?" "Worked, sir. Building's gone now. They've relocated the operation to Manchester." Peter's voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly. 17 women died that night. Mum would have been one of them if she hadn't left 10 minutes early because she heard people talking about getting to shelter before the sirens. They were talking because of your signal. The weight of that knowledge settled over Thomas like a physical thing. He had known abstractly that his warnings helped, but hearing specific stories, knowing specific names made it intensely real. "I'm glad your mother's safe, Peter. Truly." "She wants to thank you herself, but she's shy about these things," Peter continued, returning to his work. "But I wanted you to know what you did mattered. Still matters." These conversations happened more frequently as winter turned to spring. Thomas began to understand the full scope of the network that had grown from those scattered glasses. It wasn't just Harold and a few wardens. Information had flowed through the community in ways he hadn't fully grasped. A warden would tell his wife, who would mention it to her sister, who worked at a factory, and would quietly suggest to co-workers that they might want to leave a bit early on certain nights. A doctor who frequented the pub would ensure his emergency supplies were fully stocked when he noticed the MAD arrangement. An ambulance driver would make sure his vehicle was fueled and ready. One evening in early March, a woman Thomas didn't recognize entered the pub. She was well-dressed, despite the wartime restrictions on clothing, with dark hair pinned elegantly and an air of purpose about her. She approached the bar directly. "Mr. Ashford? Thomas Ashford?" she asked in a crisp, educated accent. "Well, that's right," Thomas replied cautiously. "What can I do for you, miss?" My name is Elizabeth Hartley. I work for the Ministry of Home Security." She kept her voice low, glancing around the pub. It was early evening, and only a few regulars were present. "I wonder if we might speak privately?" Thomas felt his stomach drop. Had he broken some regulation he didn't know about? Was there trouble because of the warning system? He led her to a small room behind the bar that they used for storage and private conversations. "Mr. Ashford," Elizabeth began once the door was closed, "I want to be clear that you're not in any trouble. Quite the opposite, actually." She pulled out a small notebook. "We've been tracking casualty patterns and shelter usage across London. There's been a statistical anomaly in the Bethnal Green area. Fewer casualties than surrounding neighborhoods with similar building density and similar bombing intensity. Better preparation for major raids, more efficient resource allocation." Thomas said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "It took us a while to understand why," she went on. "Eventually, our analysts noticed that this area seemed to have advance warning of the heaviest raids. Not official warnings, mind you, but people seemed to know when to take extra precautions." She looked at him directly. "They traced it back to this pub. To you." "I haven't done anything illegal," Thomas said carefully. "I just pay attention to weather patterns, moon phases, things anyone could observe." "Mr. Ashford, I'm not here to stop you," Elizabeth said, and Thomas saw the hint of a smile. "I'm here to tell you that what you're doing is valuable. The ministry would like to understand your methodology better, not to take it over, but to see if we can replicate it in other areas. There are people throughout London who have local knowledge, who understand their neighborhoods intimately. If they could be equipped with some basic training and pattern recognition, coordinated loosely, it could save thousands of lives." Thomas sat down heavily on a crate of bottles. "You want me to teach others?" "In a manner of speaking. We'd want to document your observations, understand what factors you consider most predictive. Then we'd share that information quietly with trusted community leaders in other neighborhoods, pub owners, shopkeepers, vicars, people who are natural gathering points for their communities." Elizabeth leaned forward. "This wouldn't be official, you understand. It can't be. But unofficially, guided by people who know their areas and their people, it could be remarkably effective." Over the following weeks, Thomas met several times with Elizabeth and a small team of analysts who were fascinated by his methods. He explained how he tracked the moon phases, how certain wind patterns affected bomber navigation, how cloud cover at specific altitudes mattered. They took notes, asked questions, and seemed genuinely impressed by the system he had developed through observation and intuition. "You've essentially created a localized early warning system using nothing but publicly available information and careful observation," one of the analysts said, shaking his head in wonder. "It's brilliant in its simplicity." The ministry never officially acknowledged Thomas's work, and he never received any formal recognition. But through the spring of 1941, he noticed that other neighborhoods seemed to be developing their own informal warning systems. A greengrocer in Whitechapel who arranged his window displays and patterns, a newsagent in Shoreditch whose shop sign faced different directions on different days, a butcher in Stepney whose queue management seemed oddly specific to certain evenings. Harold confirmed it one night over a drink. "It's spreading, Tom." Quietly, carefully, but it's spreading. People helping people, using whatever they have available. You started something important. But the work took its toll. The constant vigilance, the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that mistakes could cost lives. Thomas found himself unable to sleep properly, always listening for aircraft engines, always watching the sky. Margaret worried about him, seeing the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his hands shook when he thought no one was looking. "You can't carry all of this alone," she told him one night after they'd closed the pub. "You've done more than anyone could ask. It's all right to let others share the burden." "Every time I get it wrong," Thomas said quietly. "Every time I tell people it'll be quiet and then the sirens sound, I wonder how many people let their guard down because of me. And every time I predict a heavy raid and it doesn't come, I wonder if I'm crying wolf, if people will stop trusting the signals when it really matters. You're human, Tom. You're doing your best with imperfect information." Margaret took his hands in hers. "But you need to rest. You need to let yourself breathe." The tension reached a breaking point in April 1941. Thomas had predicted a massive raid based on perfect conditions: a full moon, clear skies, and favorable winds. He had arranged the glasses in the mad pattern with complete confidence. Harold had passed the word, and preparations had been made throughout the neighborhood. But the raid never came. The bombers struck elsewhere that night, targeting ports and industrial areas in other parts of the country. The night in Bethnal Green was eerily quiet, with nothing but distant thuds from raids miles away. The next morning, Thomas was exhausted and shaken. A few regulars made jokes about the false alarm, good-natured ribbing that nevertheless stung. He began to doubt himself, to question whether his system had ever been reliable or if it had all been coincidence and luck. Harold found him that afternoon, sitting alone in the empty pub, staring at nothing. "Don't do this to yourself," Harold said, sitting down across from him. "Don't let one miss destroy your confidence." "What if it's all been random?" Thomas asked. "What if I've been seeing patterns that don't exist?" "Tom, I've kept records," Harold said, pulling out a small ledger. "Every time you've signaled a heavy raid, every time you've predicted quiet nights, I've tracked them all against actual raids." He opened the book, showing pages of dates and notes. "You've been right 73% of the time about heavy raids. That's remarkable. And more importantly, you've only had 4 false negatives. 4 times when you predicted quiet and it was heavy. That's the number that matters most, because those are the ones that could catch people unprepared." Thomas looked at the numbers, feeling some of the weight lift. 73%? "Better than any official forecasting," Harold confirmed. "The meteorological office won't even share detailed weather information anymore because of security concerns, but you've been giving us actionable intelligence using nothing but observation and care. You've saved lives, Tom. That's not random chance. That's skill and dedication." The conversation helped, but Thomas remained cautious about his predictions after that. He became more conservative, only signaling mad when he was absolutely certain, being more willing to acknowledge uncertainty. Paradoxically, this made his signals more trusted. People knew that when Thomas Ashford said a bad night was coming, he meant it. As spring progressed into early summer of 1941, the character of the war began to shift. The nightly terror of the Blitz was giving way to something different. The raids became less frequent, though no less terrifying when they occurred. German attention was turning eastward, toward the massive invasion of the Soviet Union that would begin in June. But before that shift became fully apparent, there was one more night that would test everything Thomas had learned and everyone he had tried to protect. It was May 10th, 1941. Thomas had been tracking the conditions all week, and everything pointed toward a massive raid. The moon would be full and bright, the weather was clearing after days of cloud cover, and there was an almost electrical tension in the air that he had learned to recognize. He arranged the glasses in the mad pattern with grim certainty. Harold came in early that evening, took one look at the bar, and his face went pale. "You're sure about this one, Tom?" "As sure as I've ever been," Thomas replied. "It's going to be the worst we've seen. Everything's aligned for it. They'll be able to see the Thames like a silver ribbon guiding them straight to the heart of London." Harold nodded slowly. "I'll spread the word. We'll get everyone into the deepest shelters, the church crypt, the tube stations, anywhere with proper overhead protection." That evening, the King's Arms filled earlier than usual. Word had spread through the neighborhood that Thomas had signaled mad, and people were coming in for one last drink, one last moment of normalcy before descending into the shelters. There was a strange atmosphere in the pub, part wake, part defiant celebration. Dorothy and her factory friends came in, their yellow-tinged faces showing the strain of long shifts and constant fear. They ordered their usual halves of bitter and sat in their corner, talking in low voices about boyfriends serving overseas, about families evacuated to the countryside, about the small dreams they held on to that kept them going. Old Jack Thornton was there, holding court with a group of younger men who had been deemed essential workers and thus kept from military service. He was telling stories about the Great War, about the trenches and the gas attacks, and somehow making the current situation seem survivable by comparison. The Morrison family arrived together, as always. The father, Robert Morrison, was a fireman, and he would be on duty through the night. He had come to see his wife and children safely to shelter before reporting to his station. His wife, Anne, held their youngest child, a girl of about 3, while their 2 older boys tried to maintain brave faces despite their obvious fear. Thomas watched them all, these people who had become more than customers. They were his community, his extended family forged in the crucible of war. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, knowing that his warning had set preparations in motion, but also knowing that preparation could only do so much against high explosives and incendiary bombs. Margaret worked beside him, her movements efficient and calm, though he could see the worry in her eyes. She paused in wiping down a table to look at him, and they shared a moment of silent communication. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. At 8 o'clock, Thomas made an announcement. "Right then, everyone, I'm closing early tonight. Those who haven't made shelter arrangements, Harold here will guide you to the church crypt. Those heading to the tube, stay together and watch for Warden's directions. And remember, we've been through this before. We'll get through it again." There were murmurs of agreement, a few forced laughs, and then people began to move. The evacuation was orderly, practiced, efficient. Thomas felt a surge of pride watching his neighbors help each other, watching the strong assist the weak, watching the community function as it was meant to. Robert Morrison paused at the door with his family. He shook Thomas's hand firmly. "Thank you for the warning, Tom. I'll make sure the crews are positioned for the worst. We'll save what we can." "Stay safe out there, Robert," Thomas replied, knowing the man was heading into the teeth of danger while others sought shelter. By 8:30, the pub was empty except for Thomas and Margaret. They secured everything they could, following the routine they had developed over months of raids. As they worked, Thomas found himself thinking about all the nights that had led to this moment, all the observations and calculations, all the worry and doubt. "Do you ever regret it?" Margaret asked quietly as they prepared to leave. "Taking on this burden?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "No. If I have knowledge that can help people, how could I keep it to myself? The regret would be in not trying, not in the trying itself." They locked the door and made their way through streets that were already emptying. Wardens moved from door to door, ensuring everyone was accounted for. In the distance, they could see searchlights being tested, sweeping across the darkening sky in preparation for what was to come. The church crypt was more crowded than Thomas had ever seen it. Hundreds of people packed into the space, sitting shoulder to shoulder, families clustered together, neighbors sharing blankets and flasks of tea. The air was thick with tension and the smell of too many bodies in too small a space. Harold found them as they entered. "We've got people in every shelter within a mile. The tube stations are packed. Even opened up some of the old warehouse cellars that we'd deemed questionable before. If you're right about tonight, Tom, we're as ready as we can be." The sirens began at 9:15, earlier than expected. The sound cut through the murmur of conversation in the shelter, and every face turned toward the ceiling as if they could see through stone and earth to the sky above. Then came the sound everyone dreaded, the low, droning thrum of hundreds of aircraft engines. The first explosion started at 9:30, and they didn't stop for 7 hours. It was unlike anything London had experienced before. Wave after wave of German bombers, nearly 700 aircraft in total, dumped their loads across the city. The ground shook continuously. Dust and debris rained down from the crypt ceiling. The oil lamps swayed on their hooks, casting dancing shadows that made the crowded space feel even more claustrophobic. Children cried, despite their parents' best efforts to comfort them. Old Jack Thornton led the singing of "Keep the Home Fires Burning," his voice cracking with age and emotion, but never stopping. Margaret held a young woman who was having a panic attack, talking to her in low, soothing tones until the woman's breathing steadied. Thomas found himself next to a young couple he didn't recognize. They couldn't have been more than 20 years old, and the woman was visibly pregnant, perhaps 6 months along. She clutched her husband's hand with white-knuckled intensity. "First raid?" Thomas asked gently. The husband nodded. "We just moved to the area last week. I got transferred to a factory here. We didn't know it would be like this." "What's your name?" Thomas asked. James Fletcher. This is my wife, Ruth." "I'm Thomas Ashford. I run the King's Arms, the pub on the corner." He kept his voice steady, calm, trying to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. "I know it's terrifying, but this shelter is solid. Medieval construction, walls 3 feet thick. We're as safe here as anywhere in London." Ruth Fletcher looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. "The baby? If something happens to the baby?" "The baby's going to be fine," Margaret said, appearing at Thomas's elbow. "And in a few months, you'll have a little one who can say they survived the Blitz before they were even born. That's quite a story to tell." The attempt at humor fell a bit flat given the circumstances, but Ruth managed a weak smile. "I suppose that's one way to look at it." As the night wore on, Thomas moved through the shelter, talking to people, offering what comfort he could. He found Peter Walsh sitting with his mother, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, who had the red, raw hands of someone who worked with harsh chemicals. "Mrs. Walsh," Thomas said, crouching down to her level, "Peter told me about what happened at your factory. I'm glad you made it out." She looked at him with tears in her eyes. "My husband didn't come back from France. I thought I was going to leave Peter an orphan. But I heard people talking about getting to shelter early, and something told me to listen. You saved my life, Mr. Ashford." "I just paid attention to the weather," Thomas said, uncomfortable with the praise. "Anyone could have done it." "But you did do it," she replied firmly. "Don't diminish that." Around 2 a.m, there was a particularly massive explosion that seemed to lift the entire building. Chunks of plaster fell from the ceiling, and screaming filled the shelter. For a moment, Thomas thought they had been hit directly, that this was the end. But the walls held, the ceiling held, and gradually the panic subsided into shaken silence. Harold appeared, covered in dust, having ventured out during a brief lull to assess the situation. His face was grim. "The House of Commons took a direct hit. Westminster Abbey's been damaged, fires everywhere. They're saying this might be the worst night of the entire Blitz." Thomas felt sick. All his preparation, all his warnings, and still the destruction was immense. How many had died tonight despite everything? How many fires were consuming homes and businesses? How many families were being shattered? As if reading his thoughts, Harold gripped his shoulder. "But people were ready, Tom. The shelters were full before the raid started. Medical teams were positioned. Fire crews were prepared. The casualty count would have been twice as high without that preparation. Maybe 3 times as high. Remember that." The all clear finally sounded at 4:30 a.m, and people began to emerge from the shelter like survivors of a shipwreck reaching shore. The dawn revealed a city transformed. Entire blocks were aflame. The smoke was so thick it dimmed the rising sun. The smell of burning was overwhelming. Thomas and Margaret made their way home, and their hearts sank as they rounded the corner. The King's Arms was still standing, but barely. A bomb had landed in the street directly in front of it, and the blast had torn away the entire front wall. They could see straight into the interior, where their carefully rebuilt bar lay in ruins once again. Margaret started to cry, and Thomas held her, feeling his own tears threatening. But then he looked around and saw their neighbors emerging, saw people helping each other, saw the indomitable spirit that had carried them through months of this hell. "We'll rebuild," he said, as much to himself as to Margaret. "We always rebuild." Thomas never sought recognition for what he had done. The system of scattered glasses gradually became unnecessary as the immediate threat passed, though he continued to watch the skies out of habit. Harold Sutton returned to his accounting work but remained active in civil defense, the bond formed during those terrible nights never forgotten. Years later, after the war had ended and London was rebuilding in earnest, Harold would occasionally stop by the pub for a drink. They would sit together, 2 men who had lived through the storm, and remember those who hadn't made it. The glasses were always arranged neatly now, no need for codes or warnings. But the memory remained of how ordinary people, using whatever skills and knowledge they possessed, had fought their own battle for survival. Margaret would join them sometimes, and they would toast to the resilience of the human spirit, to neighbors who became family, to the strength found in community. The mahogany bar, carefully restored, bore scars from the blast that had nearly destroyed the pub. Thomas refused to have them completely sanded away. "They're part of our story," he would say, "a reminder of what we survived." The King's Arms continued to serve the neighborhood for decades after the war. Thomas eventually passed it on to his son, who had been evacuated to the countryside during the Blitz and returned a young man. The pub remained a gathering place, a keeper of memories, a testament to the ordinary people who had done extraordinary things. And sometimes, on foggy autumn evenings when the light slanted just right through the windows, you could almost imagine seeing those glasses scattered across the bar in a pattern that meant something to those who knew how to read it. A message from a time when a bartender's careful observations and quiet courage helped his community survive the longest night of their lives. The war had tested them all, had taken so much, but it had also revealed the profound strength that lived in seemingly simple acts, in the careful arrangement of glasses, in the whispered warnings between trusted friends, in the determination to protect what mattered most, even when the world was falling apart around them. Thomas Ashford had been an ordinary man who found himself in extraordinary circumstances. He hadn't carried a weapon or worn a uniform, but he had fought his own battle with the tools available to him: observation, pattern recognition, and a deep commitment to his community. In the end, that had been enough. That had mattered. And in the years that followed, whenever former regulars of the King's Arms gathered to remember the war years, they would speak of Thomas with quiet respect. Not as a hero seeking glory, but as a neighbor who had done what he could, when it mattered most, to keep them safe. That legacy, more than any medal or official recognition, was what he carried with him for the rest of his life.